tell you guys a story. So I was 14 when my sister and I started making short films because we wanted to encapsulate our time, not just to view others. We made movies about struggling to find their art, about understanding your personality and the absurdity of perfection, about finding oneself within your sins. I am driven by film, by just how fascinating it is to use a camera to manipulate movement, your surroundings, and help you tell a story you wish to tell. At the beginning of the year, I went to a director chat screening in Teatro La Tertulia here in Cali, Colombia. And the documentary that I saw was made by director Luis Ospina. And it was an exploration of Cali's art culture during the 80s. It was all about art and all they had at the time. So at the same time, it was like an embrace of all the problems that happened. And Luis Ospina was in fact part of this generation, known as the Caliwood Art Dadaist movement. I noticed something peculiar. These stories they used to focus on were extremely absurd. They were weird. At the end, Luis Ospina appeared for the conversatory, and I asked about his education, about anecdotes with artists, and the differences in working films in the United States and here in Colombia, which he expressed that in the United States there was a unique technicality of filming. It was way more centered in itself than what Colombian filmmaking is. Luis Ospina also said that the stereotypical Colombian filmmaker tries to copy what culture in the United States is, or what problems in the United States are. What's wrong with that is that they make their own version of those exact same problems, reaching an aesthetic which is in fact not natural nor real. This happens because we don't live on that exact same culture, making it seem forced and unoriginal as the themes start to revolve around basic cliché subjects. That's the biggest problem with Colombian filmmaking. It ignores the absurdity, the beauty, the chaos in which people in their own culture live in. When you place a character to live in a Latin world that surrounds them instead of that some artificial, overused, banal form of approaching a setting, then you will find the aspects of magical realism, of the craziness where the people of Colombia and the Latin culture is projected, where the stories seem real and fresh and natural. In a way, the Latin people could be considered to depend on two major aspects for their filmmaking, since the making during the colonial times. First, there's the structure, which was brought by the colonizers. And then there's the magic that comes from the indigenous tribes and adds up to that mixture. Magic has always been the aspect that explains the absurdity of beliefs, behaviors, and actions, while the structure comes from copying other cultures, which nowadays could be imposed as social media and the way technology shapes the world virtually into a more Americanized form of culture. So, if you find Latin people whose life often depends more on a social media, you can understand why they wouldn't find things as odd. If you find the people who have more problems in Latin America, you will understand how them being impacted by actions will make them believe that whatever they're experiencing is more natural than what they think. And in a certain perspective, they are actually living a form of magical realism. Magical realism started off in the mid-20th century as a literary movement by Latin American writers, such as it was Jorge Luis Borges, Pablo Neruda, and Gabriel García Márquez. These writers focused on the absurdity and magic that lies within our Latin culture. They wrote stories which are all fascinating and irrational, stories that could actually happen to people. An old man with enormous wings washes upon a beach. Characters are confined to a never-ending library, and others just chat with themselves from an earlier time. These stories capture the melancholy, the abstract, and the delusional state of one's mind, showing that Latin American culture encompasses unique types of problems from the ashes of colonization, distinguishing itself by the unbelievable and sometimes horrific stories that are now normalized. Throughout the absurdity of history, we can find that culture has been shaped by the things that happen. The way cumbia was created, for example, as a popular dance, is based on the masters asking their slaves to dance with a limited movement caused by the chains in their feet. Dare I dare to say, isn't that just shocking? However, magical realism was explored in film as well. Cali, who was part of the Dadaist art movement of the 80s, who started off by a film club created by Andrés Hermida, a famous writer from Cali, who showed international movies from European art house directors. Eventually, the film culture in Cali started to grow, as directors were inspired by those international films as an escape from the problems of Colombia in the 80s, the drugs, Pablo Escobar, the guerrillas, the corruption, the murders, the illiteracy, the kidnapping. Thus, it became the moment where artists looked upon the issues at the time and tried to find new ways to shift their minds away. It was a form of transforming emotion of pain into the catharsis of the soul through art. For example, the mockumentary Grabbing Town satirized the manipulation of the media by having a shot within a shot. As one perspective was an interview from a real person, and another one was the dramatization of a director telling the real person what to say and how to act, showing that the people were not actually as miserable as they might look, but how the media can manipulate emotions. The filmmakers at the time focused on Colombian stories with Colombian culture and with that taste of absurdity that is there in the Latin world and magical realism. These artists have shaped their minds into a state where abnormal situations start to become more normal than what they actually are. And the expression of those thoughts is what makes art be art, inspired by history. And art inspiration can come from the struggles that happen within our ambient. In Colombia, we still find the troubles of guerrillas. We still have poverty, displaced people. We still have national tragedies like the mud avalanche in Mocoa. I remember my father telling me how he went to Armero after the tragedy. It was for an architecture project. And he said the most shocking thing about the place was the silence. Feelings such as being struck by silence, it what fills one's soul and calls out for a form of expression. Despite the art form, from a film to a painting to a song to whatever you can call as a form of catharsis. That's the way art is processed. A problem enters one's mind and shapes within it to come out as a creation. Meanwhile, what could be considered as the general public of Colombia, you find they still live in a world of absurdity. They are not living based on social media nor an Americanized culture. You can even go deeper into the people and their absurd conditions. For example, some of the displaced people from Mocoa have been drawn in a literal position of life and death, with no place to sleep, with family members being crushed to death, with all their possessions gone and having to depend on cultural work in order to survive. Maybe having to do something like, I don't know, cutting sugar canes to go to a bakery and buy some pan de bono. When Garcia Marquez spoke about returning to Colombia after living abroad, he mentioned the most important idea that all artists have to take into account is that culture needs to be embraced, not denied. One must understand their origins, or as Albert Camus once said, accept your history. If you're willing to make your stories around your setting and what you have, at what actual things happen, which you could then express, then you're not just going to find a more natural film or story, but you will also find what to talk about and the truth that lays there. It's not something artificial. It's not something Americanized or forced to be made up with an unnatural aesthetic. It will be something that comes way more natural. Something that happened to your aunt or your grandfather. It will be, in fact, something that you could see with your bare eyes. We, as filmmakers and artists, living right now in a more structural world dragged by technology, social media, and the lack of our own culture, we have to look at what's in front of us. We have an amazing culture. Let's stop looking at the superficial and start feeling the real magic. Thank you.